The air was heavy with the kind of silence that only follows chaos. Sitting in the sterile conference room, surrounded by muted voices and the faint hum of fluorescent lights, I could barely focus on the faces in front of me. They were government officials, investigators, maybe even psychiatrists. I hadn't asked. I wasn't sure it mattered. "Tell us again, from the beginning," the woman across from me said. Her voice was calm, clinical. The notepad in her hands seemed to absorb her focus, as if avoiding eye contact would somehow make my story easier to digest. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It was pointless to argue, even though I'd told the same story 5 times already. "You've read the reports," I said, my voice rasping from lack of sleep. "I don't know what else I can add." "Humor us," she replied, a hint of impatience creeping into her tone. And so, I began again. The catastrophe had struck without warning, an explosion that ripped through the skyline, tearing apart steel and glass like paper. I'd been on the upper floors of a high-rise, attending a mundane corporate meeting, when the world below erupted in fire and sound. The details of my survival were hazy even now, an instinctive rush to the emergency stairwell, a surreal descent into darkness and debris. The screams of others faded into silence as I pushed forward, blind and choking on the acrid smoke. "I should have died," I admitted, more to myself than the panel. "There's no logical reason I'm sitting here." They didn't respond, just exchanged a glance that prickled at my nerves. The woman flipped a page in her notepad and leaned forward. "And the other details," she prompted. I hesitated. These were the parts I'd tried to bury, to convince myself were the tricks of a rattled mind. But every time I closed my eyes, they surfaced again. "I kept hearing something," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Not the explosion, not the collapsing floors. It was soft, like whispers, like a conversation just out of reach. I shook my head, fighting the shiver that crept up my spine. It followed me all the way down. The man sitting next to her, a balding figure with an air of weary authority, scribbled something in his notebook. "And after you made it out?" he asked. "That's the strange part." My throat felt dry as I continued. "It was chaos, people running, screaming, but there was this moment, just before I reached the ground floor. Everything stopped. The noise, the heat. It was like stepping into a vacuum. I could feel the air change. And then I trailed off, unwilling to put the rest into words. They pressed me for details, of course, and I gave them what I could. The brief but vivid image of a shadow, impossibly large, its shape wrong, as if it were folded into itself. And the sound that accompanied it, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was probably just my mind playing tricks, I added quickly, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. When the debriefing ended, they thanked me, their polite words failing to mask the unease in their eyes. I left the room with a growing sense of isolation, the whisper still tickling the back of my mind. It didn't take long for the strange occurrences to begin. At first, they were subtle, easy enough to brush off as stress-induced paranoia. A fleeting movement in the corner of my vision, shadows that seemed to stretch too far in the pale glow of my bedside lamp. The sensation of being watched when I was alone in my apartment. I blamed the trauma, the insomnia, the endless replay of the disaster in my mind. But the more I ignored it, the harder it became to dismiss. One night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the whispering. It wasn't like before, faint and fleeting. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if the words were being formed just behind the walls. I sat up, straining to make sense of the sound, but the moment I focused, it vanished. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. My voice sounded hollow in the stillness of the room. But sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it brought dreams that left me drenched in cold sweat. In them, I was back in the high-rise stairwell, the walls around me groaning and warping as I descended into an endless abyss. The whispers were louder there, pressing in from all sides. And then, just as in reality, the vacuum of silence returned, followed by the shadow. I woke gasping, the sound of my own breathing filling the dark room. My clock blinked 3:17 a.m. in an accusatory red. The whispering had stopped, but the unease lingered like a stain. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to distract myself with work and routine, but the sense of wrongness clung to me. Every reflection, windows, puddles, mirrors, seemed to show something slightly off. It was nothing I could pinpoint, just a vague distortion at the edges of my vision. When I finally dared to look closer, it was always gone. By the end of the week, I stopped trying to convince myself it was my imagination. Something was there, watching, waiting. But what it wanted, and why it had chosen me, remained a terrifying mystery. The artifact came to me in the least likely way. An unmarked envelope slipped under my door. Its contents weren't immediately unsettling. A single photograph, yellowed and faded with age, depicting a fractured and crumbling structure that resembled the high-rise from the disaster. But there were differences, subtle ones. The windows seemed too narrow, and the angles of the building bent in ways that defied logic, as though its blueprint had been sketched by someone unfamiliar with the rules of geometry. I turned the photo over, half expecting a handwritten note or some cryptic message. There was nothing, just a small embossed mark, an emblem of interwoven circles, almost like a seal. Its simplicity should have been mundane, but it felt ominous, as though it watched me as intently as I watched it. Where had it come from? Why now? My first instinct was to toss it aside. Perhaps it was a prank, some leftover item from an investigator's file. But the whispers returned that night, louder than ever, and with them came the realization that the photograph wasn't an accident. I spent the next day researching the disaster's aftermath, sifting through public records and obscure articles. Most were familiar by now: casualty reports, theories about structural failures, and heart-wrenching survivor accounts. Yet, the further I delved, the more inconsistencies I uncovered. Several survivors, people I remembered seeing during the evacuation, were listed as missing or unaccounted for, their names disappearing from official rosters entirely. It was then I noticed something chilling. The emblem from the photograph appeared in several images of the site, etched faintly into the foundation stones and even carved into a mangled piece of rebar. In some pictures, it was barely noticeable, blending into the chaos. But it was there, always there. I stared at the symbol until it was burned into my mind. Something about its interconnected loops felt ancient, almost primal, like a signature left by a hand that had shaped the world long before humanity ever walked it. As night fell, I turned the photograph over and over in my hands, searching for some clue I might have missed. My apartment, bathed in the orange glow of a streetlight, felt smaller, heavier. The silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the occasional hum of traffic outside. I could feel the tension building in my chest, a sense that I was on the brink of uncovering something I wasn't meant to see. And then I saw it. Under the glow of a lamp, faint symbols appeared in the photograph's corner, etched in the paper like scars. They weren't part of the original image, I was certain of that. These were runes, impossibly intricate, curving and twisting like vines. As I traced their pattern, the whispers returned, soft and insistent, as though coaxing me to understand. "What are you?" I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The whispers didn't answer, but their presence lingered, heavy and cold. The photograph felt alive in my hands, thrumming faintly with energy. I knew then that I couldn't stop. Whatever had chosen me, it wasn't done yet. The artifact, the photograph, was just the beginning. It led me to places I would never have dared to tread otherwise, starting with a dilapidated library on the outskirts of the city. The building had long since been abandoned, its windows shattered, its doors chained shut. Yet when I arrived, I found the padlock missing, the doors yawning open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. The bookshelves stood like forgotten sentinels, their contents crumbling into illegible fragments. But amid the rot and neglect, one section of the library was untouched, its shelves pristine, its books arranged with meticulous care. Above them, the interwoven circles of the emblem gleamed faintly, etched into the wood. My heart pounded as I approached, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The titles were cryptic, books about ancient architecture, the geometry of the cosmos, and esoteric philosophies that hinted at truths I couldn't yet grasp. One, however, stood out, the Veiled Foundation. Its spine bore the same runes I had seen on the photograph, their patterns now uncomfortably familiar. I pulled it from the shelf, the leather-bound cover cold against my palms. Inside, the pages were yellowed but intact, filled with diagrams and sketches that defied explanation. They depicted impossible structures, staircases that twisted into the sky, doors that opened onto nothing, and columns adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse as I stared at them. The text was dense, written in a language I couldn't read, but the illustrations told a story I couldn't ignore. Each building was marked with the emblem, and each was connected by thin lines that formed an intricate web. My disaster site was there, its jagged profile unmistakable. But so were others, scattered across the globe, each tied to a location where calamity had struck: earthquakes, fires, floods. My breath hitched. These weren't random accidents. They were part of a pattern, a deliberate design etched into the fabric of reality itself. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their cadence sharp and urgent. They seemed to emanate from the book, wrapping around me like tendrils. As I turned the final pages, my hands trembling, I found one last illustration: a massive black void encircled by the emblem. Its center was empty save for a single word, written in jagged, unfamiliar script. I closed the book with a snap, the whispers cutting off abruptly. The room felt darker now, the shadows deeper, as though the library itself disapproved of what I had uncovered. I left without looking back, the book clutched tightly to my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, I could feel the web closing in, its strands tightening with each breath. I was no longer a spectator. I was part of the pattern. And somewhere beyond the veil of my understanding, something was watching and waiting. The whispers no longer came and went. They had become a constant presence, threading through my every thought like static. They weren't words, not exactly, but patterns of sound and sensation, each one pulling me closer to something vast and incomprehensible. Sleep had become an afterthought, my nights consumed by fevered sketches of the emblem and the strange structures from the Veiled Foundation. The more I drew, the more the shapes seemed to draw themselves, as though my hand was merely a vessel. I was unraveling, and I knew it. But I also knew I had no choice but to continue. The threads of the pattern were tightening, their presence manifesting in the world around me. Streetlights flickered in my presence, casting impossible shadows. Reflections in windows seemed to lag, showing glimpses of someone or something that wasn't there. Even the air felt wrong, heavy with an unspoken expectation. And then, the invitation came. It arrived in the same way as the photograph, slipped beneath my door in the dead of night. This time, It was a small card embossed with the emblem, its lines gleaming faintly in the dim light. Below it, an address, a location deep within the city, where the streets narrowed into forgotten alleys and the skyline disappeared into a maze of overpasses. No date, no time, just the address. I knew what it meant, though I couldn't explain how. The web had drawn me to its center, and the answers I sought were waiting. The building was derelict, its facade a patchwork of peeling plaster and exposed brick. The windows, covered in grime, reflected the pale light of the moon like dull mirrors. The door stood ajar, its rusted hinges groaning as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and something metallic. The interior was a hollowed-out husk of a space, an abandoned warehouse or factory, long stripped of purpose. But at its center stood something that demanded my attention. An enormous circular platform etched with the emblem. It glowed faintly, its lines pulsing in time with the whispers that now hummed in my skull. The edges of the platform were lined with jagged, angular structures resembling the sketches from the veiled foundation. Each structure shimmered faintly, as though existing only partially in this reality. As I approached, I saw faint symbols glowing along the edges, runes I recognized but could not read. The whispers surged as I stepped onto the platform, the sound vibrating through my bones. The emblem beneath my feet began to shift, its lines rearranging themselves into new, unfamiliar patterns. A sudden hum filled the air, low and resonant, and the light from the platform intensified, casting the entire space in an eerie, pulsating glow. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the hum grew louder. The structures around the platform began to shift, their forms elongating, twisting in ways that defied logic. And then, from the very center of the platform, the void appeared. It wasn't darkness, not entirely. It was absence, a hollow emptiness that seemed to devour the light around it. My eyes refused to focus on it, sliding away as though repelled. Yet, at the edges of my vision, I could see it moving. The void wasn't static, it pulsed, its shape rippling as if alive. The whispers reached a crescendo, their tone shifting from coaxing to commanding. I could feel their intent, their demand. Step forward. Look. I hesitated, my body trembling under the weight of the unseen force pressing down on me. But I couldn't resist. My feet moved as though guided by an invisible hand, carrying me closer to the void. The air grew colder, sharper, until each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. When I was close enough to touch it, the whispers stopped. Silence fell, deafening and absolute. The void seemed to pulse in response, its edges folding inward, revealing faint shapes within. Threads, strands of light woven into an intricate web. Each thread glimmered faintly, and as I watched, I realized with a jolt that they weren't static. They moved, shifting in patterns that mirrored the structures I had seen in the book. And then I saw myself. Not my reflection. Something worse. My image was suspended within the web, distorted and fragmented, as though seen through a fractured lens. I watched as the strands wove around me, binding me into the pattern. And then I understood. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a piece of the design, a cog in a mechanism that spanned centuries. The disaster, the whispers, the emblem, they were all part of the same vast tapestry, a machine operating beyond comprehension. And I wasn't here to stop it. I was here to ensure it continued. The void pulsed again, its rhythm syncing with my heartbeat. The threads around my image tightened, and I felt a deep pull in my chest, as though the web was reaching for me. I turned to run, but the platform's glow flared, the light enveloping me. And in that moment, the truth became clear. The pattern could not be stopped, only perpetuated. and I was its latest thread. When the light faded, I was alone in my apartment, the whisper silent. The photograph was gone, the book too. But the emblem had etched itself into the frost on my window, its interwoven circles a final reminder that I would never escape the web. I wasn't a survivor. I was the beginning of something else.